Welcome back. If you're here, it's probably late. Maybe your room is dimly lit or already dark. Maybe your sheets are pulled up around your shoulders and there's a soft hum in the background. The fan by your bedside, the quiet hum of the night outside, or the familiar tap of a gentle rain. Either way, you've made it here, to this quiet place, and you've chosen to let someone tell you a story while the rest of the world fades away. So take a deep breath. Let your shoulders sink a little lower. And if you truly enjoy this kind of peaceful journey into the past, you can like the video, subscribe if you'd like to return, and if you're still awake enough to lift your hand, leave a comment with the time it is where you are right now. We'll be here together for a while. Tonight, we're not looking at kings or castles. We're not marching into war or standing beside queens in velvet halls. No swords will clash. No speeches will echo. Instead, we're stepping quietly through the muddy lanes and narrow alleys of a world long gone. We're going to meet the people history often forgets, the ones who held strange tools, who walked the less traveled paths, who did the jobs nobody else wanted to, the ones who didn't wear armor or carry banners, but without whom everything would have fallen apart. These were the workers of the everyday, the cleaners, collectors, haulers, tasters and mourners. People whose roles were so normal, so constant, so necessary, they were barely written down at all. And that's what makes them worth remembering. Because while some built cathedrals and others led armies, these men and women were lighting fires before dawn, digging trenches, climbing bell towers, and walking miles with nothing in their hands but a bucket or a bell. Tonight, you'll hear about them. Not in a rush, not with fanfare, just one at a time, with quiet care, the way their work deserves to be remembered. Their tools were simple, their names were ordinary, their jobs were strange, sometimes unpleasant, sometimes almost unbelievable, but they were real, and they mattered. So get comfortable, let the details unfold slowly. There's no need to keep track. You don't need to remember the order or even stay awake for the whole thing. Let the stories wash over you like warm water, soft and slow. We'll begin with a man who worked at night in silence with a long-handled scoop and a cart that no one wanted to see. A job that required a strong stomach and a stronger will. His name isn't written in any history book, but if you lived in the village, you would have known exactly who he was. Let's begin. The air was different at night, cooler, heavier, quieter. While the rest of the village settled into sleep, windows shuttered, fires dimmed, bodies curled beneath wool and straw. He stepped out into the dark with a lantern and a cart. His work began only when others had finished theirs. No one asked him to hurry. No one asked him anything at all. They simply stayed inside and let him pass. He was called a gong farmer. The word gong didn't mean what it means now. Back then, it came from the old English term for filth or waste. And a gong farmer was exactly that. One who farmed filth, not in the fields, but beneath them. His domain wasn't the pasture, but the cesspit. Every house, even the smallest, had one. A hole dug behind the building or beneath a wooden floor, lined with stone or timber, meant to collect what the family left behind each day. When it filled, and it always did eventually, someone had to empty it. Someone had to reach down, scoop it up, and carry it away. He would arrive with long-handled tools, shovels, scoops, rakes with teeth too wide for farming. His bucket was made of thick wood, banded with iron. The cart creaked when it moved, and groaned louder when it was full. He dressed in heavy cloth, wrapped tight at the wrists and ankles, but the smell still found its way in. always. The work was done by lamplight. No one watched. That was part of the unspoken deal. He kept to the alleys, to the back corners of town. He moved through spaces no one else wanted to walk. His boots were soaked through before the first bucket was lifted. His hands cracked in winter, even under gloves. In summer, the heat made the stench bloom like something alive. He didn't complain. Or if he did, no one remembers it. The job was necessary. Everyone knew that. And though they avoided his eyes during the day, they never forgot to leave coin by the door when he passed. Sometimes the waste was left in a pile at the edge of town, buried under layers of straw and ash. Other times, it was taken to the river, poured slowly, washed away without ceremony. In cities, it might be sold to farmers as fertilizer. In some places, it was burned. But always, it had to go somewhere. It couldn't stay. The gong farmer rarely spoke. He didn't need to. His work announced him from streets away. Children held their noses when he passed. Elders turned their backs. But the clever ones nodded in respect, because they understood what he carried was not just filth, but burden. The village depended on him, even if they pretended otherwise. And yet, there was a kind of freedom in the role. He moved through the night without question, without oversight. He answered to no master but the rising smell. He saw the village in its quietest hours, when only owls and stars looked on. He knew every corner, every hidden door, every path between buildings too narrow for daylight. Sometimes he would pause beside the well, rest his arms on the edge of his cart, and breathe, not through his nose, but through the practiced calm of someone who has stopped resisting what cannot be avoided. He would take a sip of water, wipe his hands on the cloth around his waist, and move on. There were dangers. The pits could collapse. Gases could collect and choke a man without warning. In deeper cities, some climbed down into the sewers, waist-deep in darkness, guided only by touch and memory. Those men didn't always return, and when they did, they were quieter than before. But for most gong farmers, the work was rhythm, the same route, the same houses, the same weight of the bucket, the same creak of the wheels. There was peace in repetition, a strange, grim dignity in knowing the village stayed clean because you were willing to be dirty. And when the sun finally rose, he was gone, back to whatever cottage he slept in. Clothes hung outside to air, tools rinsed in a shallow stream, his cart left empty and waiting. By the time the villagers opened their shutters, the lanes were clean. The air was lighter. The day could begin. And no one spoke of the man who had passed through the night, leaving only the faintest trace of ash in the alley. He didn't ask to be remembered. He only asked to be paid, and to be left alone until the pits filled again. If you ever saw him during the day, you might not have looked twice. He didn't dress like a lord, or even like a tradesman. His clothes were patchy, dark with grease and wear, his boots mismatched, his cap pulled low over his brow. He carried a sack on one side, and something like a small cage or wooden box on the other. There might have been a stick in his hand, long, whittled smooth from years of use. And if you got too close, you'd notice the smell. Not of rot exactly, but of fur and dust and the faint sting of vinegar. He was a rat catcher, and in the medieval world, his job walked the line between necessary and feared. Rats were everywhere, in the barns, in the kitchens, in the grain stores, under the floorboards. They moved in shadows, chewed through sacks, scattered when doors opened. No one invited them in, but they always found their way. They stole food. They left droppings. They gnawed the edges of the world, and people learned to live with their presence like they might with rain or wind. But sometimes, especially in cities or dense villages, the problem grew. The noises under the floor became too loud. The flour turned grey. The children woke with bites on their arms. And worse, sometimes, came with the rats. Illness, fever, buboes, death. People whispered about plague, even when it hadn't yet arrived. They blamed rats, even if they didn't fully understand why. That's when they called him. He didn't knock. He waited near the gate, or on the edge of the square. Word would reach him eventually. A nod from the baker, a quiet hand signal from a stable boy. And when the day cooled, and most people were headed home, he would make his way to the trouble spot. He used traps sometimes. Small wooden boxes rigged with pressure plates and bits of salted meat. But more often, he relied on instinct and on the animals he carried with him. Ferrets, long and sinuous, with sharp eyes and sharper teeth. They darted into holes, down tunnels, into grain chutes, and emerged minutes later with a wriggling shape in their jaws. Sometimes he let the ferrets run loose. Sometimes he held a leash. Either way, he trusted them more than he trusted people. He moved quietly, watched the walls, listened to the scratching beneath floorboards. He would kneel for minutes without speaking, ear pressed to the side of a barrel, fingers gently brushing a trail of droppings. Then he'd strike, sudden, sharp, a thump of a stick, a blur of motion, and one less rat in the world. He didn't kill them all. That wasn't possible. Rats always returned, but he could thin the numbers, scare them off, break the rhythm of a nest. He knew their habits better than most. When they bred, where they hid, how long they'd stay before moving to the next cellar. And when he was finished, he'd show you the catch, sometimes in a sack, sometimes strung by the tail, sometimes laid out like evidence. Then he'd be paid, usually in coin, but sometimes in bread, or cured meat, or even old boots. He didn't haggle. He took what was offered, and he left before the sun rose again. Some said he spoke to the rats, that he whispered their names before catching them. Others claimed he carried the plague with him, tucked in his coat, that death followed him the way shadows follow a flame. No one ever asked where he came from, or where he went when the job was done, but they always watched when he passed. Children dared each other to run behind him. Adults stepped aside, subtly, pretending to be busy with something else. And yet, when the noises started again, when the scratching returned and the droppings lined the corners of the pantry, they would send word. Quietly, quickly, and hope he returned. There was a power in what he did, though he never spoke of it. To hold the line between the safe and the vermin-filled, to protect food stores, to chase off the unseen. He didn't wear a badge. He didn't keep records. But he was a keeper of sorts, of balance, of cleanliness, of the uneasy truce between people and pests. And in a world where disease moved like smoke, where rats were more than a nuisance, his role was heavier than it seemed. He didn't just catch animals. He caught fear, tamed it, bottled it for a little while, then vanished into the narrow spaces from which he came. In the morning, the rats would be gone, the grain left untouched, the scratching quieted, and life would resume, if only for a while. No one thanked him aloud, but they noticed. High above the market square, where most villagers never bothered to look, a slow wheel turned against the sky. It groaned with weight, with age, with repetition. Inside it, a man walked, not forward, not toward anything, but in circles, inside a giant wooden drum large enough to hold him upright. His footsteps powered a machine older than he was, and it lifted stones, one after another, higher than any ladder could reach. He was a treadmill crane operator, though no one ever called him that to his face. Most simply called him the wheelman. Cathedrals, castles, towers, they rose slowly, inch by inch, across the landscape, and they didn't build themselves. Before engines, before steam, before pulley systems had names, these towering feats of architecture were lifted into place by men like him. Not masons, not lords, but walkers. Steady, heavy-footed walkers, tucked inside a creaking circle of wood and rope. The wheel was built from thick oak, bound together with iron nails and reinforced with beams along its spine. It was suspended above the worksite, attached to a framework of scaffolding and crossbars. Ropes ran from the wheel down to pulleys, through blocks, and finally around the stones below. Every turn of the wheel pulled those ropes tighter, lifting a burden from the earth into the air. His job was simple in description, but never in execution. He stepped forward, step by step, just as if he were walking a path, except there was no destination, no change in scenery, just the groan of wood, the scrape of rope, and the strain in his legs. As he walked, the wheel turned. As it turned, the rope rose. And as the rope rose, so did the block of stone tied to its end. Balance was everything. If he walked too fast, the load could swing and crash into the scaffolding. If he moved too slow, the masons shouted down from above. But usually, they didn't shout. They respected the wheelman. You had to. He held the weight of your tools, your timbers, your very work in each step he took. The air up there was colder. Wind tugged at the edges of the wooden frame. The wheel was open to the sky, and he could see far, across rooftops, over fields, sometimes even to the next village on a clear day. But he rarely looked. His eyes stayed down, watching his feet, the rope, the rhythm of the wheel. Distraction meant slipping. Slipping meant falling. And there were no second chances from that height. He wore gloves in winter, though they did little against the cold. In summer, he wrapped cloth around his brow to catch the sweat before it blurred his vision. He drank little while working, just enough to stay upright, never enough to dull his senses. His meals were simple: bread, dried meat, sometimes a bit of cheese tucked into a pouch. He ate with his back to the wall, one leg still half in the wheel. No one trained him. He learned by watching, then by trying. The first time, his steps were clumsy. The wheel stuttered. The stone bobbed dangerously. A mason dropped his trowel in fear. But the boy kept walking. One step, then another, then another. By the end of the day, he knew the rhythm. By the end of the week, he belonged to the wheel. Some days the work was endless, load after load, stones, tools, buckets of mortar. Other days, he waited. Wind too strong, rain too slick. When it was safe again, he stepped inside, took a breath, and began to walk. He didn't speak much to the others. From his height, conversation was rare. But when he passed through town, they gave him space. Not out of fear, but respect. His was a job without glamour, but with weight, literal and otherwise. When they looked at the cathedral spire rising above the village, they didn't think of his steps, but they should have. He never asked for recognition. He didn't sign the stones. He didn't carve his name into the rafters. But his footsteps were there, in every inch of height, every stretch of wall, every stone that now stood where once there had been sky. And when the work was done, when the final block was set and the scaffolding pulled away, he stepped out of the wheel one last time. he walked down the long, narrow ladder. He touched the ground with both feet, and for the first time in years, he walked straight ahead, not in circles. People asked what he would do next. He only shrugged. The next town, perhaps. Another tower, another wheel. But for a moment, before he left, he stood at the edge of the square and looked up. Really looked. At the height he had helped build. At the structure that would stand for centuries. And though he said nothing, a small smile crept onto his face. Because even if no one else remembered, the wheel did. And that was enough. If you happened to be walking through the village green one afternoon and saw a man sitting on a bench in a pair of unusually thick leather trousers, with a pint of ale in one hand and a blank expression on his face, you might have mistaken him for a drunk. But if you looked again at the seal hanging from his belt, the calm method to his sipping, the scribbled notes tucked into his pouch, you'd realize you were watching something very official. This man wasn't here to relax. He was working, and in his own strange way, he was safeguarding the public trust. He was an ale conner, an officer of taste and texture, appointed by the local council to test the quality of every barrel brewed within the town walls. Not to judge its flavor exactly, but its strength, its consistency, and most curiously, whether it made a proper seat. You see, in the Middle Ages, ale wasn't just a drink. It was a staple, safer than most water, brewed in homes and taverns, sold by the jug or cup to rich and poor alike. And because it was everywhere and part of every table, it had to be watched. The village couldn't afford weak brews watered down for profit, or worse, foul-tasting ones that made the drinker ill. Someone had to ensure standards. Someone had to sit down for the truth, and that someone was him. The process was simple, though strange. He would arrive at the brewers with little fanfare, just his seal, his pouch, and his famous trousers. Thick leather, cured and stiff, designed not for warmth or style, but for performance. A small stool would be coated with ale, poured directly from the barrel in question. Then, the ale conner would sit, still, focused, solemn, for a set amount of time. When he finally stood, the result was clear. If the leather stuck to the bench, tugged against the surface, or even made a soft tearing sound, it meant the ale had enough body, enough sugar and substance to be considered passable. If he stood with ease, leaving behind no trace or stick, the brew was too thin, watered down, unworthy of the village table. That, of course, was only part of the inspection. He would also taste. Not a gulp, never a toast, but a measured sip. He rolled the liquid on his tongue, not for pleasure, but for purity. Was there bitterness beyond the norm? An off scent? Too much yeast? Too little grain? He could tell. Years of practice had trained his tongue to detect even the subtlest deception. He'd then marked down the results on a scrap of parchment, on the wood of the door, or sometimes simply committed to memory. A fine brew might be awarded a smile, a nod, a whispered word of praise passed from one neighbor to another. A poor one, a warning, a penalty. In some towns, the ale could be dumped. In others, the brewer fined. Occasionally, repeated offences earned harsher punishments. The closing of a tavern, the public shame of a broken mug nailed above the door. But most brewers took pride in their craft and welcomed the ale conner like they might a midwife or mason. His approval meant business. His presence meant the village took its drink seriously. And he, in turn, took the work to heart. He didn't overindulge. He never lingered in one place too long. He paced himself, not out of fear of drunkenness, but out of duty. A dull tongue meant a flawed inspection, and he'd rather skip a meal than compromise his taste. He travelled light, a satchel for notes, a tin for coins, a small stick of chalk for marking barrels. His boots were worn, but his coat neat. He moved from town to town in some cases, or stayed within one parish for life in others. He was respected, not because he wielded power, but because he protected something everyone shared. There were jokes, of course, about the trousers, about his unique qualifications, about whether he ever stood up from the bench and couldn't leave. He took them in stride, laughed when it felt right, but never during a tasting. That was sacred. Sometimes he trained another, a nephew, a neighbor's boy with a keen nose and quiet manner. He'd show them the ropes slowly, let them taste, let them test, let them sit on the stool once or twice when no one was watching, but only when they could do so with the same calm, steady presence he carried did he allow them to wear the seal. Years passed like this. All changed. Recipes shifted. New grains arrived from far-off lands. But the Connor remained, a quiet presence, a familiar silhouette at the edge of the tavern, a reminder that even the most ordinary things, the drinks we share, the moments we gather, deserve someone watching over them. And on a cold night, when the tavern glowed warm and the mugs clinked and the laughter rose, he would sip once more, take his final note, and vanish into the evening. The village safe for another day, all thanks to a man in leather trousers and the ale beneath him. In some corners of the countryside, far from cathedrals and courtrooms, there lived a man who waited not for the harvest or the hunt or the turning of seasons, but for the stillness that followed death. He was not a priest nor a physician. He wore no robes. He gave no sermons. And yet, he dealt in souls. When someone died, and the family wished to cleanse the spirit before it passed beyond, they called for him, not with bells, but with coin, wrapped in cloth, placed at the door. No words were needed. He would know. He was a sin-eater. It wasn't a title given by the church or the state. It wasn't written down in any official record. But among the cottages and hills, the name meant something. He was the one who took what no one else dared to carry. Not burdens of flesh or of coin, but something stranger, something less visible, but heavier in its own way. When a person died, there were rites to be followed, prayers to be said, candles to be lit. But what of their sins? What of the things left undone, unsaid, unresolved? Not everyone trusted that a whispered confession on a deathbed would be enough. Not everyone had the means to hire a priest. And so, for those uneasy families, there was a final meal, and someone to eat it on the dead's behalf. He would arrive at dusk, always dusk, a time between light and dark, between day and night, between life and death. He wore a dark cloak, the kind that could pass through wind and bramble without complaint. His boots were always muddy, his eyes tired but calm. He didn't knock. He waited to be let in. And once inside, he said nothing until the meal was placed before him. It varied from house to house. A piece of bread, a bit of meat, sometimes a mug of ale or a boiled egg. But always it was placed on the chest of the deceased, laid gently over the heart, or across folded hands. The family gathered round, heads low, eyes lowered. No one spoke. The sin-eater would remove his gloves, kneel beside the body, and lift the food. He didn't smile. He didn't cross himself. He simply began to eat. Slowly, methodically, each bite taken in silence. The only sounds were the creak of the floorboards, the soft breath of mourners, and the quiet crunch of bread between teeth. To those watching, this act wasn't about hunger. It was about transference. As he chewed, they believed he was drawing in the sins of the departed, pulling them away from the body through the meal into his own being. Wrath, greed, lust, envy, all taken up, swallowed down, carried away. When the food was gone, he drank whatever was given. Ale, water, sometimes wine, if the family could afford it. Then he would wipe his hands, rise slowly, and nod once. That was all. No blessing, no warning, no goodbyes. Payment, if not already left at the door, would be offered in silence. A few coins, a loaf of bread for the road, perhaps a candle stub to light the way home. He took only what was given and never asked for more. Then he left. He did not stay for the burial. He did not speak to the priest. He did not return for a second visit. Some said he was cursed, that by eating sins he became more ghost than man, that no grave would accept him when his own time came. Others believed he was holy in his own way, a quiet guardian, carrying the darkness of others so they could pass into the light. But most just pitied him. He lived on the edge of the village, usually alone. His cottage small, his garden sparse. Children whispered stories about him, how he could see spirits, how he never aged, how he walked without casting a shadow. Adults didn't say much, but when death came again, they sent for him just the same. No one knew what he did with the weight he carried, if it pressed on his chest as he slept, if it soured his food or soured his dreams. He never spoke of it, never gave interviews or wrote down his memories. He simply lived, day by day, one meal heavier each time. And when he died, because even sin-eaters die, there was no one to take his place. No apprentice, no written guide, just a grave on the edge of the woods, unmarked, save for a stone worn smooth by rain. They say no priest came to bless him, no candles were lit, no food placed on his chest. Perhaps by then he had eaten enough. If you heard his cart before you saw it, the sound might have made you wince. A faint jingle of metal on metal, a wooden wheel turning over cobbles, and a creak that seemed to echo with something too sharp to touch. Children whispered stories when they heard that sound. Some would run to peek from behind shutters. Others turned away. But one thing was always true. Wherever the tooth drawer set up, a small crowd gathered, even if most of them wished they hadn't come. He was a traveling tradesman, not quite a barber, not quite a physician, and certainly not a surgeon, not in the way we think of it now. He was something older, cruder, and far more feared. He was the man people went to when they had no other choice. Tooth pain in the Middle Ages wasn't just an inconvenience. It was torment, a rot that worked its way down into the bone, causing days of swelling, sleepless nights, fevers, and slow infections. There were no antibiotics, no numbing agents, no soft-spoken dentists with gloves and bright lights, just pain, and eventually the desperate need to remove the source of it. That's where he came in. He traveled from town to town with his kit, a wooden box filled with iron tools, cloths for binding, and sometimes a handful of herbs soaked in strong wine. Some tooth drawers worked alone. Others joined market fairs, setting up beside other loud, messy trades. He preferred the edge of the square, close enough to attract attention, but far enough that people could pretend not to see. He called out to passers-by with a practiced rhythm. Tooth troubling you. Can't sleep. Can't chew. One pull, and you're free. He said it like a promise, like a spell. And some came forward. They sat on a stool, blinking into the sun, face twisted with fear and pain. He would lift their chin gently, press 2 fingers along the jaw, tapped the tooth in question. He could tell immediately if it was loose. If it wasn't, he'd nod once and reach for his pliers. They were not delicate instruments. They resembled blacksmith's tongs more than surgical tools, broad, iron, worn with use. He wrapped the handles in cloth so his hands didn't slip, and sometimes to muffle the sound. He had no anesthesia, only the advice to bite down hard on a strip of leather, or to grip the edge of the stool and count to 3. Then he pulled. It was not elegant. It was not quick. Sometimes the tooth broke. Sometimes it brought part of the jaw with it. Sometimes it took 2 tries. And yet, for all that, the moment the tooth was out, the worst was often over. The pain changed from sharp, sickening ache to a dull, throbbing relief. He stuffed the socket with moss or cloth soaked in vinegar. He tied the jaw shut with a rag. He gave instructions in few words. Don't eat meat. Rinse with ale. Sleep upright. Payment was whatever could be offered. A coin, a loaf of bread, a new rag for his kit. Some gave him nothing. Some gave him more than he asked for, simply grateful to breathe without pain. He rarely smiled. His work wasn't pleasant, and he never pretended it was. But he didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. And for many, that was enough. There was more to his trade too. He didn't just pull teeth. He filed them when requested. He sharpened others to fangs for those who fancied themselves warriors or devils. He replaced teeth with carved pieces of bone or ivory, set into the mouth with pitch or twine. Some even asked for charms, small carvings to be worn on a necklace, said to protect against rot or bad dreams. He didn't always believe in them, but he made them anyway. And when the crowd dispersed, when the last mouth had been opened and the last coin pocketed, he packed up quietly. He cleaned his tools in water that turned pink, then dark. He wrapped the bloodied cloths in another cloth. He wiped the stool clean with his sleeve. Sometimes he left a tooth behind, dropped in the dirt, kicked away by a passing boot, and then he moved on. He slept outside most nights, under his cart or beside a crumbling wall. He kept his tools close, and a dagger closer. People feared him, but not enough to leave him unbothered. And he had learned the hard way that fear didn't always mean safety. He had no family, no apprentices. His knowledge was not written down. It lived in his fingers, in the angle of his wrist, in the way he read a jawline. When he passed away, whenever that was, it likely went with him. But for those who met him, for those who had once sat trembling on his stool, jaw clenched, breath shallow, he was not so easily forgotten. He was the man who made the pain go away, even if it hurt to get there. Before the sun had fully risen, before the baker's fire had warmed the morning air or the blacksmith's hammer had struck its first blow, she was already at the edge of the water. The ground was cold beneath her feet, soft with dew and mud, and the mist still clung to the surface of the marsh like a thin veil. She moved slowly, deliberately, lifting her skirts just above the knees, revealing legs wrapped in cloth, bound tight, but never thick enough to stop what was coming. She was a leech collector, one of the quietest and strangest jobs in the medieval world. Not a healer, not quite, but not far from it either. Her work began where the land met the water, and where the medicine of the time leaned into something older, something darker, something that felt more like folklore than science. In those days, the body was thought to be ruled by humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, it was believed, came from imbalance, and often the cure was to take something out, to bleed the sickness away. Leeches became the tool for this task. Not just a curiosity or a swamp-dwelling parasite, but a living instrument used to draw blood in slow, steady pulses. But before they could be applied to flesh, they had to be gathered. And so she waded in. The best time to collect leeches was early, when they were hungry and near the surface. They hid in reeds and among the stones at the edge of still water. They sensed movement, warmth, the rhythm of a heartbeat beneath the skin, and when they felt it, they came. She didn't swat them away. She stood still. She let them climb. They attached themselves in silence, their tiny mouths gripping tight. She felt the sting, the numbness that followed, and then the warmth. Blood drawn out through skin, swallowed drop by drop into the belly of something cold and dark. One leech, then two, then more. She didn't look down. She waited until her legs were dotted with them, clinging like beads of obsidian. Then, with practiced hands, she plucked them free, gently, never ripping. She dropped them into a clay pot lined with wet moss, where they curled and coiled and pulsed. She moved a few steps deeper, repeated the process, and again. A full morning could yield dozens. There were other ways, of course. Some tied raw meat to their ankles, luring leeches without offering their own flesh. Others dragged cloth bags through the shallows, hoping to catch a few at random. But she found these less reliable. The leeches preferred living flesh. They responded to warmth, to heartbeat, and so she gave them hers. She wore the marks for days, small welts that bled long after the leech was gone. Her legs carried dozens of scars, some faded, others permanent. She cleaned them with vinegar or salt, bound them when they bled too freely. But she never complained. The leeches were sold to apothecaries, to barber surgeons, to wealthy households who believed that a timely bloodletting could prevent fever, madness, or even heartbreak. Each creature fetched a small price, enough to live, if not to thrive. Sometimes she was asked to apply them herself, to the swollen limbs of the sick, to the temples of the fevered, to the stomachs of pregnant women thought to be carrying bad humors. She would sit beside the patient, whisper soft words, press the leech into place, and watch it swell with red. There was an intimacy in the work, a closeness to the body that others found unsettling. She was not a healer, but she brought relief, and sometimes that was enough. People didn't often speak to her in town. They turned their eyes elsewhere. Children stared, then ran. But no one stopped her from walking the streets. No one refused her coin. Because despite the strangeness of her trade, despite the shadows that clung to it, her work touched every family eventually. When she wasn't working, she sat near the edge of the marsh, sewing or eating from a cloth-wrapped bundle. She watched the birds. She listened to the frogs. The land never judged her. The water never asked her why. In winter, the leeches vanished. The marsh froze, and she waited, sharpening knives, mending nets, preparing for spring. The cycle always returned. No one else wanted her job. Few could stomach it. Fewer still could endure it. But she did. Not for glory, not for love, but because the world needed it, and she knew how to listen to the quiet places where medicine still lived in mud and blood and silence. At night, she washed her legs in warm water, wrapped them in clean cloth, and counted the small, dark shapes twisting in the moss-filled pot by the fire. They glistened in the light, slow, patient, waiting for their turn. And somewhere, not far away, another home would soon need her work. There was a corner of the village most people avoided, not because it was cursed or dangerous, but because it always smelled of something sharp and sour. The scent clung to the air like steam, drifting over low walls, into open windows, and even into your clothes if you lingered too long. It wasn't death, but it wasn't far off. It was the smell of stale urine, soaked into cloth, warmed by sun and stirred by bare feet. And it meant one thing: the fuller was at work. Most people never thought about how their clothes came to be soft, strong, and wearable. They saw the wool, they wore the tunics, but they didn't think about the long, painful journey between fleece and fabric. And if they did, they certainly didn't think about the fuller, the person who stepped into cold troughs at dawn and didn't step out again until the bells rang for supper. Fulling was the process of finishing cloth. Raw wool, once woven, was loose, greasy, and riddled with oils from the sheep's coat. It needed to be tightened, cleaned, and thickened into something usable. And for that, the cloth had to be soaked in liquid, trampled underfoot, and rinsed again and again until it shrank into shape. The liquid, in most places, it was stale human urine, known as chamber lye, collected from households in buckets, sometimes sold by the poor, and left to ferment in large vats. Urine was rich in ammonia, a natural cleanser. It broke down oils, lifted dirt, and helped the wool fibers bind together. But it came at a cost. The smell was overwhelming. The texture of the cloth underfoot was thick, heavy, and slimy. The work was hard, and the fullers paid with more than just fatigue. They started early, before the village stirred, before the baker had rolled his dough. The cloth had to be soaked for hours, sometimes overnight, and then the walking began. Bare feet pressing down again and again. Slow, methodical steps, as if treading water made of vinegar and mud. There were usually 2 or 3 of them, taking turns, moving in slow circles within the trough. Their skin pruned quickly, their legs burned. In winter, the vats were cold as stone. In summer, the heat made the smell bloom into something unbearable. They said you could always tell a fuller by their feet. Thick-skinned, cracked, stained yellow by time, and by their silence. The work didn't encourage talk. It left little breath for it. Most fullers were men, but not always. Some women joined them, especially when a family needed the coin. It wasn't considered noble, but it was considered necessary. Once the walking was done, the cloth was removed, wrung out, then beaten with wooden paddles, another long process, meant to flatten the weave and stretch it evenly. Then came the rinsing. Bucket after bucket of clean water poured over the cloth, flushed through it, until the smell began to fade, and the wool took on its proper texture, dense, weather-resistant, ready for the tailor. Only then was it hung to dry, draped over wooden frames or lines strung between beams. The wind moved through it, the sun burned off the rest, and the fuller, exhausted and sore, would sit by the side of the vat, head bowed, hands resting on knees, shoes still untouched where they'd been left that morning. Few people thanked them, even fewer acknowledged them, but everyone wore their work, the cloaks on the backs of soldiers, the robes of monks, the heavy blankets on winter beds. All passed through the hands and feet of a fuller. Their labor clung invisibly to every woven thread. There were dangers too. The chemical exposure ruined skin over time. The constant contact with ammonia burned open wounds, and infections were common, yet there were no better alternatives. The richer towns used fulling mills powered by water wheels, but in most villages it was still done the old way, by foot, by flesh, by force of will. The fullers knew each other across towns. They could spot one by the set of the shoulders, the slight limp, the faint smell that no amount of washing could quite remove. They didn't form guilds, not in the way smiths or masons did, but they shared tools, tips, and sometimes silence, shoulders touching while resting beside a steaming vat. At the end of the day, the Fullers returned home in second-hand clothes, smelling faintly of work, hands stained and knuckles raw. They washed as best they could, ate what was warm, slept deeply, and when the bell rang again the next morning, they returned. No fanfare, no audience, just cloth and water and the long, quiet rhythm of the feet. You would hear him before you saw him, a steady clank of iron on iron, the dull echo of a bell struck by hand, followed by a voice, not loud in anger, but loud in clarity, measured, rounded, trained to cut through the fog of early morning or the murmurs of a market crowd. He called out in a tone that asked not for your attention, but assumed it, because for that moment, his voice was the voice of the town itself. He was the town crier, not a soldier, not a priest, not a merchant or a mayor, but something in between, an announcer of decisions, a deliverer of decrees, a walking newspaper in a world without print. His job was to speak clearly, loudly, and without hesitation, whatever message had been passed down from above. He started his route at dawn, cloak drawn against the chill, boots already dusted with dew. He wore a hat, usually feathered or broad, both for formality and function. A scroll or folded sheet of parchment rested in his belt, and in his hand, always, the bell, a small one, not too heavy, but with a sharp tone that could rattle windows when needed. He had a set path through the village. It began at the church steps, passed through the marketplace, the guild square, and then down the road by the taverns and the lower houses. At each stop, he would ring his bell 3 times, wait for silence, then unroll the paper and begin to read. His voice had a rhythm, somewhere between a chant and a song. Hear ye, he began, though the words varied by town and time. Let it be known, by the order of the mayor, to all honest men and women within earshot. These were the phrases that made people stop, lift their heads, and listen. The messages were varied: a change in market hours, a new tax on ale, a warning of thieves seen on the road. Sometimes it was good news, a festival to come, a travelling minstrel show arriving, or the birth of a noble's child. Other times it was grim, the sentencing of a criminal, the spread of illness, the price of bread climbing again. He didn't choose what to say. He only carried the words, but how he said them mattered. A poor reader could lose the crowd. A hesitant voice might spark rumors, but he was steady, even. He read each word like it was carved in stone, never rushed, never too slow, and always with enough space between sentences for the meaning to land. People learned to trust that voice, even if they didn't like what it told them. Children followed him sometimes, mimicking his bell with sticks, pretending to be criers themselves. Dogs barked as he passed. Merchants paused mid-sale. Housewives leaned from windows. His presence meant something was happening, something new, something important, something that tied the village together through common knowledge. When he wasn't announcing, he listened. People came to him with questions. When will the bridge repairs finish? What did the message say yesterday? Did you hear if the merchant's son returned? He remembered things. He gathered whispers, not to gossip, but to be prepared. Because if another message came, urgent, unclear, unfinished, he would be the one to give it shape. He had to be trusted. He had to be understood. In some places, he also read proclamations of punishment, standing beside the pillory or the scaffold, his bell hanging silent at his hip as he spoke the crimes and their cost. These moments were colder. He stood taller. His voice didn't shake. But when he folded the parchment again and stepped away, he did so quietly. He was paid by the town, a small wage, enough to live, though never lavishly. Some villagers offered him bread, or repairs for his cloak, or a seat by the fire in winter. He accepted what was given without pride or shame. He served all, and all knew him. He didn't keep a family, or if he did, they remained quiet, out of the spotlight. His work made him too visible, too exposed. Every misstep could echo. Every word was remembered. But at night, when his voice finally rested and the bell was hung by the door, he was just another man. Tired, grateful for silence, listening to the very peace he spent his day disturbing. And if he dreamed, perhaps it was not of crowds or speeches, but of quiet streets, of parchment that read only, "All is well," and of bells that never needed to ring again. The graveyard at night is not silent. The wind moves through the crooked stones, dragging low branches against earth and bark. Somewhere nearby, a barn owl cries. Farther still, the faint clip of hooves on a road no longer lit. But between these sounds, so familiar to the night, you might miss the quietest one of all. A soft scrape of iron, a breath held too long, and then the faintest thud of something lifted from the soil. He worked quickly. He had to. The longer he lingered, the greater the risk. But he wasn't careless. Every movement was measured, every tool chosen for its silence. A thin spade, its edge rounded with use. A short rope, coiled like a snake. A sack, folded tight, smelling of dust and old straw. He didn't speak. He didn't hum. His heartbeat was already loud enough. He was a resurrectionist, a body snatcher, a thief of the dead. He didn't see himself as a criminal, not in the way the town watch did, not in the way the priest preached. He saw himself as practical, as necessary, as someone doing a job few others were willing to touch. Because in the quiet corners of universities and behind the doors of apothecaries, knowledge had a cost, and that cost, more often than not, was a fresh corpse. Anatomy had become a subject of study, but cadavers were hard to come by legally. Executed criminals were few, and their bodies often reserved for public display or specific institutions. But the demand grew. Medical students needed to learn. Surgeons needed to practice. And so, someone had to supply what the law could not. That someone was him. He didn't choose the graves. That decision came from elsewhere. A doctor's note, a letter with coin, a whispered word passed in a tavern or alley. He was told where to go, and he went. Always at night, always alone or with a trusted hand. The soil was never fully settled. Graves dug recently were easier to work with, looser, less compact. He cleared the topsoil gently, pulling back flowers and stones, setting them aside to be replaced later. Then he dug, not all the way down, just enough to reach the coffin lid. He avoided the center, going for the head or feet, depending on the angle. The goal was speed, not elegance. When the lid was exposed, he worked the nails loose. Quietly, carefully. He opened it just enough to slip in the rope, to wrap it beneath the shoulders or under the arms. Then, with slow and practiced motion, he pulled. The body rose stiffly, weighted with silence. He didn't look at the faces. Not really. He had learned not to. The fresher ones still had color. The older ones brought flies. But in the dark, it all blurred together. He wrapped them tight, cinched the sack, and began to refill the grave. It was important that the site look untouched. A disturbed grave drew eyes. Eyes brought questions. Questions led to arrests. Once the soil was back in place, he returned the flowers, repositioned the stone, scattered leaves as though the wind had passed through recently. Then he was gone, his sack heavier now, his breath tight against the cold. He travelled the back roads, avoided the main gates. Sometimes he used a cart, sometimes just his own 2 feet. He moved slowly, but with purpose. If stopped, he had answers. If caught, he had coin. The delivery was quick. The body handed over, the coin exchanged. No names, no signatures. Just an agreement that one needed and the other provided. And then he vanished again, slipping into the shadows from which he'd come. He never stayed in one town too long. Too many disappearances raised suspicion. Too many questions led to lanterns in the graveyard, to guards posted at the gates. He moved like water, filling the spaces no one else dared, retreating before the light caught up. Some saw him as a villain, others as a necessary evil. Few knew his face, fewer still knew his name. But his work was known in the bones that lined medical halls, in the sketches etched on parchment, in the knowledge whispered from surgeon to student. He didn't seek thanks. He didn't expect forgiveness. He only asked for silence, for time, for nightfall, because long after the mourners had left, long after the candles had gone out and the prayers had faded into memory, he would return, not to mock, not to desecrate, but to lift what the world had already let go, and to walk once more beneath the moon with a burden few would ever carry. Out beyond the thatched roofs and the low stone walls that marked the end of the village proper, there were fields. They stretched outward in slow rolling lines, patched with green in spring and gold in summer. But beneath those colours, beneath the grass and grain, there was something harder, colder, and older than anything that grew. Stone. It surfaced every year, after frost, after heavy rain, after the plough had carved its first pass. Stones pushed up from the earth like forgotten memories, scattered in irregular patterns across the soil. They broke tools, they bent blades, they made planting slow and harvesting worse. And so, before anything could be sown, before the year's work could begin, someone had to pick them. He was that someone. He wasn't a farmer, exactly. He didn't own the land. He didn't decide what crops were planted or when they'd be harvested. His work came before all that, before the seed, before the sweat, before the promise of anything to come. He was the stone picker, and his job was to make the land ready. He arrived before the sun had risen far enough to warm the ground. The dew was still thick on the grass, his boots soaked through within minutes. He carried no tools, just a pair of gloves worn to the thread, a sack at his hip, and a back already bent with habit. The stones varied. Some were smooth, round, the size of apples. Others were jagged, sharp-edged, lurking just below the surface, waiting to catch on a blade. He moved slowly, step by step, scanning the ground like a scavenger. When he saw a stone, he stooped, picked it up, tossed it into the sack with a practiced flick, then moved on. All morning, the sound of rocks hitting the sack, a soft clunk, then silence, over and over, a rhythm not unlike rain on a rooftop or the ticking of an old clock. He worked alone. It was solitary labor, often overlooked, but it mattered. Left in place, the stones could ruin a plowshare, snap the wooden teeth of a rake, twist an ankle mid-harvest. And the more a field was worked, the more stones seemed to rise, as if the land itself was never quite finished resisting. By midday, the sack was heavy. He would empty it near the edge of the field, where a pile had already formed. Stones from years past, stacked into crude pyramids or used to patch nearby fences. Some of the larger ones were carted away for building. Most simply remained, silent proof that someone had walked this path before. He paused only briefly to drink. Cold water from a tin flask, or ale if it was a feast day. Then back to work. The stones didn't collect themselves. There were no markers to guide him, no rope or post to show where he'd been. He walked by memory, by instinct, by the subtle shift in the ground beneath his boots. He didn't need to see every stone to know where they waited. He could feel them through the soles of his feet. Children sometimes watched from the edge of the field, curious at first, then quickly bored. There was nothing dramatic in what he did. No swinging axe, no fire. Just the slow, steady gathering of things most people ignored. But the farmers noticed. The ones who followed behind with seed sacks and plows. They noticed when the ground was smooth, when the blade didn't catch, when the harvest was easier than it should have been. And though they rarely said it aloud, they knew who to thank. He didn't expect much in return. A meal now and then, a place to sleep when the work carried him far from home. He lived simply, traveled often. His hands were calloused, his back hunched. But he moved with the patience of someone who understood the land, not in theory, but in touch, in weight, in resistance. Sometimes he talked to the stones, not loudly, just a word or two, muttered as he bent to lift them. "You again?" Or, "Didn't I move you last spring?" It made the work lighter somehow, gave shape to the silence. And when the field was cleared, he didn't linger. He nodded to the farmer, accepted whatever coin or bread was offered, and walked on. There were always more stones, always more fields, always more ground to prepare. He left behind no signature, no carved initials, just a smoothness in the soil, a readiness, and a silence where once there had been sharpness. Because long before the feast, before the harvest songs and heavy carts of grain, someone had come quietly, stooped low, and made the land soft again. The bell tower rose above the village like a finger pointing toward the sky, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets below. Birds circled its peak in the early hours, nesting in the slats between timbers, and from time to time the faint hum of wind slipping through the openings sang like a ghost in the rafters. Most villagers never climbed that high. They heard the sound the bell made. They felt it in their bones when it rang, but few ever saw the man who pulled the rope. He lived in the tower's lower chamber, a small room with stone walls and a wooden cot, barely wide enough for a grown man to stretch out his arms. It was cold in winter, unbearably hot in summer, and always filled with dust, but he preferred it to the chatter of the streets. Up here, he had a kind of peace, a distance from the noise of daily life, and his duty was simple: to ring the bell. He did not decide when it rang. That decision came from the church, or the town elders, or the rhythm of the days themselves. Morning prayer, midday meal, vespers in the evening, but also births, deaths, fires, invasions, weddings, floods. The bell was not just a call to worship. It was a voice that spoke on behalf of the whole village. He rose early, long before most others stirred. He washed his face with cold water, tightened the rope around his waist, and climbed the narrow stairs to the belfry. His hands trailed the walls as he ascended, fingertips brushing grooves worn smooth by decades of footsteps before his own. The bell was enormous, bronze darkened with soot and age, hanging heavy from thick beams of oak. It didn't move easily. It didn't respond to casual force. It needed rhythm, commitment, a kind of reverence. He gripped the rope in both hands, leaned back, and let his weight do the work. The first pull was always the hardest. A deep groan from the timbers above, a tremor in the rope, then the slow swing of the bell. The sound didn't burst so much as bloom, growing from a low hum to a full-bodied peal that shook dust from the rafters and made sparrows flee from the steeple. He counted each ring in his head, not aloud, just a quiet rhythm, marked by the beat of his heart and the sway of the rope. 9 for the morning call, 3 for a death, 12 at noon, and once, long ago, a single toll at midnight, followed by silence that stretched for hours. When the ringing ended, he would rest, sitting cross-legged in the corner of the tower, watching the village through the narrow arch. He saw everything from up there. The baker opening his shutters, the smith hammering red-hot iron, children chasing each other between puddles. But it all seemed smaller from that height, quieter, like a painting slowly unfolding. He kept a journal, though no one knew, scraps of parchment hidden beneath a loose floorboard, filled with short entries. Rang for a wedding, bride wore blue. 2 bells at dawn, brothers died of fever. Rain all night, rope slippery this morning. It was a record not just of sounds, but of life itself. The work aged him quickly. His shoulders were broad but worn, his palms lined with calluses. His hearing faded not from silence, but from too much sound, too close, too often. And yet, he never once let someone else ring the bell. It was his task, his voice to give to the village. Some days, when there was no call, he still climbed the stairs, just to be near it, just to run his fingers along the side of the bell, feel the cold metal, the faint indentation where the striker had kissed it thousands of times. He'd stand there in silence, watching the town below, not as its messenger, but as its quiet observer. When he passed through the village, on market days or holy days, people nodded, children whispered. Some thanked him, others didn't know what to say. After all, he wasn't a priest or a merchant, or a man with stories to tell. He was the one who rang the bell, and that somehow was enough. Years passed, seasons shifted. The bell cracked once during a winter storm and had to be recast. He stood silently by as they melted it down, then helped raise the new one into place. Its sound was different, brighter, less heavy, but he learned its voice too. And when his hands could no longer pull the rope, when the stairs became too steep and the mornings too cold, he trained a boy, not his own, but quiet, steady, respectful of the task. He showed him the rhythm, the count, the care. He watched him ring it once and nodded. Then he returned to his room beneath the stairs, laid down on the cot and closed his eyes. In the days that followed, the bell rang for him. 3 slow tolls, echoing out across the rooftops, the fields, the woods beyond. And though his name faded, though the dust settled and the rope frayed, the sound remained. He did not wear the beaked mask. That was reserved for the doctor. The black robe, the leather gloves, the wide-brimmed hat, those belonged to the figure who moved silently through the town, appearing like a shadow when the sickness came. But just behind him, never far, always one step removed, was the assistant, less feared, but no less essential. You might not notice him at first. He didn't ring bells or carry cymbals. He dressed plainly in dark wool and a cloth over his mouth, hands wrapped in linen soaked in vinegar. He carried the bag, the oil, the salves. He held the lantern at night, and when the doctor pointed to a door, he opened it. When plague swept through a town, and it always swept, never crept, panic came first, then silence, then smoke, fires in the street, doors nailed shut, markets abandoned. The streets took on a stillness that wasn't peace, but surrender. And through that stillness walked two figures, the doctor and the boy behind him. He was often young, not a physician himself, sometimes a student, sometimes an orphan who had nowhere else to go, sometimes just a boy who owed a debt. He didn't need to understand the sickness to witness it. He saw more in a week than most men did in a lifetime. He helped carry the book of names. Families left notes pinned to shutters or scratched into the wood itself, pleas for help, records of who still lived. The assistant would copy them, marking who was sick, who had died, and who had vanished altogether. He read aloud to the doctor when the mask was too thick to allow for sight. He took dictation. He made the ink. When they entered a house, the air changed, thick with fever, rot, and fear. The assistant moved quickly, opening shutters to let in light, dousing vinegar on cloths to cover the smell. He handed tools to the doctor, cleaned them afterward, and sometimes, when hands were needed, held down a patient while they writhed. He was not a healer, but sometimes he was the only human touch the dying ever felt. He learned not to flinch, not at the blackened fingers, the burst buboes, the sound of breath rattling like broken glass. He learned how to tie a mask properly, how to wrap a body for burial, how to speak softly through linen, so that even the dying could feel they were heard. He slept little, ate less. There were too many homes, too many bodies. The dead outnumbered the living in days. The carts filled faster than the prayers. And still, he returned each morning to the doctor's side. They moved in silence, broken only by instructions. Mark this door. Leave a pouch for the widow. Take his name. Close her eyes. And he obeyed. There were no crowds, no applause. Only quiet faces peeking from behind curtains, and the rare whispered, "Thank you," offered from a window left ajar. When the doctor burned herbs in the street, the assistant stirred the pot. When a man collapsed in the alley, it was he who checked for life. When there was no one else to dig the grave, he dug. He didn't ask questions, but sometimes, when the doctor slept, or stared silently at the wall as if he too was sick, he would write, in a little book, not a ledger, not a journal of death, but moments, bits of conversation, the shape of a hand curled around a rosary, a boy singing to his mother, not knowing she'd already gone. He needed to remember that it wasn't all disease, that there had been people. When the plague lifted, and it always did eventually, the town came back slowly. Doors unbarred, markets reopened, but many faces were missing, and many would not speak of the days before. The doctor would leave, as they always did, called to the next afflicted village, the next black mark on the map. Sometimes he asked the assistant to follow, sometimes not. Either way, the boy remained behind changed. He no longer feared illness, not in the same way, but he feared silence. He feared forgetting. And so he stayed, walking the streets as they filled again, watching the children play, watching life reassemble itself. And on certain nights, when the wind shifted just right, he could still smell the smoke and herbs, still hear the soft tap of the doctor's staff against stone, still see the long shadow moving ahead of him through the plague-stricken streets. He did not wear the mask. He did not sign his name in books, but he remembered. And for many, that was the only reason they were not forgotten. He lived near the edge of the quarry, where the trees grew thin and the earth turned pale and dry. The ground there crumbled underfoot, always coated with fine white dust that clung to boots, hair, eyebrows, everything. It coated the stones, hung in the air, drifted in the wind like mist. Even when the lime kilns weren't burning, the place smelled of heat. Not smoke exactly, but something sharper, like a fire that had soaked into the rocks and never quite gone out. He was a lime burner, and his trade was older than most could remember. A craft of fire and stone, of watching and waiting, of knowing exactly when the rock had turned from what it was into what it needed to become. It began with limestone, quarried from nearby cliffs, chalky, heavy blocks that chipped easily and left white streaks across the skin. He carted them by hand or with a mule, stacking them near the mouth of the kiln. The kiln itself looked like a crude chimney laid sideways into the hill, a circular pit lined with brick or stone, wide enough to crawl into, but deep enough to vanish inside. He built the fire first, layers of dry wood, peat, sometimes even charcoal when it could be spared. Then he laid the limestone above it, filling the kiln until it brimmed like a heavy pot. Once lit, the fire would burn for days, not hours, days, 2, 3, sometimes longer, depending on the size of the load and the weather. He tended it constantly, day and night. In the dark, he watched the faint glow of flame leaking through the cracks in the stones. He listened for the hiss of steam, the pop of rocks splitting from the heat. He stirred the fire with long iron rods, shifting the coals without getting too close. One mistake, one misplaced step, one moment too near the kiln's mouth, and the heat could blind you, blister you, turn your lungs to ash. He wrapped his face with cloth, wore thick leather gloves, but even then the heat found him. It seeped into his bones, into his dreams. His skin was always red, always dry, his voice rough, worn thin from breathing in dust and smoke for years. When the fire had burned itself out, he waited. The kiln cooled slowly, as if reluctant to give up its fury. Only once it was safe would he pry open the side and begin to unload. The limestone, now transformed, had become quicklime, a brittle, flaky substance that crumbled easily and burned if it touched water or bare skin. It looked like chalk, but was dangerous, caustic, alive in its own way. Quicklime had 100 uses. It was spread over the dead to speed decay and mask smell, mixed into mortar for stone walls, scattered in latrines to keep rot and rats at bay. Used by tanners, farmers, builders, gravediggers. Every village needed it. Few thought of where it came from, and even fewer knew who burned it. He worked alone, not because he preferred it that way, but because few could stand the conditions, the dust, the heat, the long silence broken only by the roar of fire and the sound of stone cracking in the night. Sometimes children came to watch from a distance, staring wide-eyed at the blaze, the spark spiraling into the stars. They called him names: Ashman, Smoke Eater, Ghostsmith. He didn't mind. It kept them from getting too close. He lived in a small hut not far from the kiln. No decorations, just a bed of straw, a water barrel, a wooden spoon, and a tin bowl. The walls were white with lime dust, even the inside of the roof. It was always settling, always in motion. He didn't talk much, had no wife, no children, but he knew the rhythm of fire better than most, knew their own heartbeat. He knew how to build it, how to feed it, how to listen when it whispered that it was hungry again. And when his lime was ready, bagged in heavy sacks or packed into carts, he would walk it into town, slowly, carefully. The villagers stepped back when he passed, not out of fear, but respect. He didn't smell like smoke. He smelled like stone, like something that had been to the center of the earth and come back different. They paid him in coin, or salt, or food wrapped in cloth. He accepted it with a nod, said little, and returned to the kiln before sunset, because the earth always offered more limestone. And someone had to keep the fires burning. There are trades that go unnoticed, and then there are trades that people go out of their way to forget. In the darkest hours of the night, when the lanterns were out and the taverns had emptied, a figure would appear on the streets, pushing a heavy cart, carrying a long-handled shovel, and walking with the quiet determination of someone whose work began when everyone else's had ended. He was the gong farmer. Gong was a polite word, a softened syllable that stood in for something far less pleasant. It referred to human waste, night soil, as some called it, and his job was to remove it from the pits beneath the privies, the cesspools behind inns, the trenches that ran under manor houses, and through the winding guts of the city. All of it, dug out, hauled away, and taken to places no one else cared to know. He worked by torchlight, not because he feared being seen, but because his work couldn't be done in daylight. It was forbidden in most cities, too foul, too disruptive. So he came after sundown, when the air was cooler and the smells didn't rise so quickly. The tools of his trade were few: a wide, flat shovel, a bucket with a thick handle, and a wheeled cart with boards so high they blocked the sight of what sat inside. He wore boots of leather sealed with wax, gloves stiff with lime, and a scarf tied tightly around his nose and mouth. None of it helped much. The stench clung to everything, to his clothes, his hair, the skin beneath his nails. Even after washing, even after scrubbing with vinegar and lye, the smell remained. It lived in his beard, in the folds of his coat, in the look people gave him as he passed. But without him, the city would drown in its own waste. The streets would reek, the cellars would flood, disease would bloom in every corner. He knew this, and so did the city, which is why, for all the disdain he received, he was paid well, sometimes more than a craftsman, sometimes more than a clerk. He didn't live in the city centre. No gong farmer did. He kept a small hut near the edge of the fields, beside the dumping grounds where night soil was buried or turned into fertilizer. The land around his home grew thick with strange plants, tall, strong, always green. The soil was rich, even if no one dared touch it. He rarely spoke, not out of bitterness, but because his work required solitude, focus, the handling of something everyone wanted gone, quickly and completely. He became a kind of shadow, known only by the sound of his wheels on cobblestone and the occasional creak of a hinge as a privy door swung open in the dark. Children whispered stories about him, that he lived underground, that he could talk to rats, that he carried a curse in his cart and could fling it at anyone who insulted him. He let them believe it. It kept them from following too closely. In truth, he took no pride in the filth, but he took pride in doing what needed to be done. He moved with care. He cleaned the edges of the pit when he finished. He replaced every board. He left the place, if not fresh, at least bearable. And he never left a job half finished, no matter how deep, no matter how foul. On some nights, he worked with a helper, usually someone desperate for coin, willing to hold a lantern or carry a second bucket. They rarely lasted, The smell turned their stomachs. The weight broke their backs. The silence unnerved them. He didn't blame them. It was not a trade one chose lightly. But he returned, night after night, and in his own way, he was part of the city's rhythm. A necessary presence, invisible by design. When morning came, he was already gone. The pits emptied, the doors shut, the cart rinsed, if not clean, at least ready. And the city, waking to fresh bread and open markets, never paused to think of what had been done while they slept. But the gong farmer thought of it. As he sat outside his hut, sipping ale strong enough to mask the scent in his throat, he watched the sky shift from black to grey. He listened to the birds begin their songs, and he smiled. Because no matter how thankless the work, the city was clean. And for one more day, it would stay that way. Just as the last threads of sunlight slipped behind the rooftops and the blue of the sky gave way to the deeper shades of evening, he emerged, a long pole in one hand, a box of oil and matches in the other, and a steady gait that spoke of years spent walking the same route. He was not in a hurry. The darkness could wait. It always did, just long enough for him to catch up. He was the lantern lighter, and his duty was to chase back the night, one small flame at a time. In a world before electricity, before glowing windows and humming lamps, the night was something else entirely. It was thick. It had weight. Once the sun fell, the streets grew treacherous, not from what was seen, but from what was not. Cobblestones vanished into shadow. Doors disappeared. The very outline of the town seemed to dissolve into something less certain. And that's when he arrived. Each evening, just after dusk, he began his walk. The lamps were spaced along the main road, iron posts with small glass housings, each holding a wick, a reservoir of oil, and the promise of a little safety. Some towns had them every 100 steps, others only at crossroads, but no matter how many, he knew them all. He would reach the first one, open the latch, clean the soot from the glass with a cloth tucked into his belt, check the oil, and strike a match. The light always flickered at first, a soft sputter like a child unsure of its own voice. Then, with a breath of wind or a slight adjustment of the wick, it would steady. A circle of golden light would bloom around him, pushing back the dusk just a little. He would close the latch, make sure it held, then move on. The next, then the next. His pole was not just for height. It held a small hook to lift the glass, a prong to steady the flame, a notch to adjust the wick. He used it like an extension of his own arm, practiced and sure. People knew him, but rarely interrupted. He wasn't seen as a figure of conversation. He was a presence, a rhythm. The soft footfall followed by the crack of a match, the hush of oil catching light, the faint scrape of glass being closed. His was the work you noticed only when it didn't happen. And once all the lanterns were lit, the town felt different, safer, defined again. Shadows softened, paths returned, faces could be seen in passing, not just imagined. A merchant closing up shop, a girl running home before curfew, a priest locking the chapel door. All could nod at him in passing, their way lit by the flame he'd left behind. He walked with a slow grace, not because he was old, though he often was, but because each light deserved the same care. If he moved too fast, the flames would gutter. If he moved too slow, the night might outpace him. But he never rushed. He trusted the rhythm. He wore a cloak, thick and weatherproof, and a hat pulled low when it rained. His boots were soft-soled, so as not to disturb sleeping dogs or nervous watchers behind windows. He carried with him a sense of calm, as though the act of lighting something so small against so much darkness gave him quiet certainty. Sometimes children followed him for a time, enchanted by the simplicity of his task. They asked if he was afraid of the dark. He would shake his head and tell them softly, "You don't have to be afraid if you're the one carrying the flame." And in the deepest winter, when the snow muffled all sound and the night seemed endless, he still made his rounds, breath curling in front of him like smoke, boots crunching softly in the frost. He lit each lamp with numb fingers, wiping away ice from the glass, coaxing reluctant flames to life. He never failed. In the morning, before the sun fully rose, another man would come to extinguish the flames, the snuffer, a quiet role, often unseen. But the lighter and the snuffer knew each other, not well, but enough to nod in passing, a kind of shared understanding. One began the night, the other ended it. He never lit the last lantern with a flourish. No dramatic gesture, just the same careful motion, the same pause to make sure it held. Then he would step back, look once to be sure the flame was steady, and walk on. When he returned home, the sky was black and full of stars. His hands smelled of smoke and oil. His boots left trails of soot and mud. He would sit, remove his hat, and exhale, slow and deep. The town was lit, and for another night, the dark had not won. He didn't wear robes or rings or any mark that would tell you who he was. If you passed him on the road, you might think he was a peddler, just another man with a cart, a long coat, and a face too tired to invite questions. But the rattle that followed him, faint but unmistakable, told another story. A dry, hollow sound. Not metal, not glass, bone. He was the bone collector. In the villages where no graveyards had been tended for generations, and where charnel houses overflowed with old remains, he did the work no one else wished to speak of. He walked the forgotten paths, past the hedgerows and ruined walls, into the fields where battles had been fought or famine had crept through silently, leaving no witnesses. He brought with him a long-handled hook, a sack, and a small jar of chalk dust. Bones did not frighten him. They were not sacred or cursed or horrifying. They were simply what remained. They did not speak, but they told stories in their own way, through the curve of a rib, the thickness of a skull, the way a femur had once borne weight before it was stilled forever. He could tell by the texture, the color, the brittleness, how long the bone had lain there, whether it belonged to a child or a man, whether it had been buried hastily or left exposed to weather and time. And when he found them, he lifted them gently, as though they might still feel it. Some bones he buried, off the road, beneath trees, marked only by a small stone. Others he brought back, if they were requested. Some apothecaries bought powdered bone, believing it strengthened the blood. Some blacksmiths used bone ash to temper certain steels. Some churches requested relics, or at least bones old enough to pass for them. But most often, he was called by the city. During times of plague, war, or poor burial practice, the dead had a way of rising, if not in spirit, then at least in presence. Bones surfaced in rivers, washed up in floods, crumbled out of hillsides, and someone had to gather them, to take them somewhere quiet, somewhere respectful, or at the very least, somewhere far from where people lived. He would arrive with little notice, sometimes with a mule, sometimes on foot. The townspeople often turned away. They didn't wish to see the sack, to hear the clatter of joints, to remember that beneath their streets and walls and beds lay thousands who had come before. But he remembered. He knew the routes. He knew the unmarked mass graves. He knew where old abbeys had once stood and where the leper colonies had buried their own. He did not fear them. He walked with care, sometimes stopping mid-step when he saw something half buried, a finger bone curled like it had once held a pen, a scapula resting in the grass like a broken wing. He never sang, but sometimes he hummed, a low tune without words, as if the rhythm helped his feet know where to stop. When he had gathered enough, he would return to his small hut, built of stone, roofed with moss, walls lined with shelves. He sorted what he found, cleaned it, laid it out like a puzzle only he understood. He recorded none of it. There was no ledger, no archive, just the memory he kept, names unspoken, stories unfinished. But he remembered each one, even the ones too broken to tell apart. At night, he lit a single candle, and the shadows of bones danced across the ceiling. He did not pray, but he often whispered, "You were once someone." And that was enough. In the warm haze of early afternoon, when the sun filtered through the smoke-hued glass of narrow windows, she sat at her bench, hands steady, apron stained, breath faintly sweet with tallow and wax. The room around her was quiet, but not still. Beeswax melted slowly in a pot over coals, wicks dangled in neat rows from a wooden rack, and the air shimmered with the soft scent of lavender and smoke. She was the candle maker. Her trade was a quiet one, not loud like the smith or bright like the merchant, but it touched every home, every table, every hour touched by darkness. In the time before oil lamps and glass bulbs, there were only candles, and those who made them were keepers of light itself. Her day began early, not with fire, but with thread. The wick mattered more than most knew. Too thick, and it would gutter. Too thin, and it would drown in its own wax. She spun it herself, from flax or hemp, tight and even, knotting each length at the base with fingers long trained in patience. She worked with two kinds of wax: beeswax, golden and clean, and tallow, rendered from animal fat, cheaper and easier to find. The wealthy bought beeswax. It burned with less smoke, a sweeter smell, and a steady flame. But most could afford only tallow, and so she boiled it down in a wide pot, skimming impurities, pouring carefully into the mold. Dipping was the old way, the trusted way. She would lower a dozen wicks into the pot, draw them up, let them cool, then dip again. Layer by layer, the candle took shape, not poured, but grown, like something alive. It could take hours to make a batch, days if the weather was poor and the air too cool for wax to set. In summer, the heat softened everything. Wax dripped and bent, refusing to hold. In winter, it hardened too fast, cracking if touched too soon. But she adjusted. A shutter opened, a brazier lit. She knew the balance. It was in her bones. The tools she used were simple: copper pots, wooden frames, scissors, molds of iron or clay. But each held its place. Each was worn by use, smoothed by years of being held just so. She cleaned them with hot water, vinegar, and ash. A clean mold meant a clean candle, and a clean candle meant trust. She sold them by the dozen, tied with twine, packed in cloth. The market sellers bought them. So did the priests, the innkeepers, the midwives. Some households came only once a month. Others came weekly, depending on how long their nights were. Candles marked time. A short taper burned for prayer. A thick pillar lasted all through dinner. A single beeswax light was kept for births, deaths, or when someone was too afraid to sleep in darkness alone. She made those candles with extra care. No one thanked her for them, not really. But when the shutters closed and the hearth dimmed, when only the wick still flickered in the window, it was her light they turned to, her light that held back the dark. She worked alone, not because she disliked company, but because the work demanded silence. The wax spoke when it melted. The wick whispered when it caught flame. She listened. Some nights, when the orders were done and her hands were sore, she lit a single candle, placed it in the center of the room, and watched it burn. She studied the way the flame bent and steadied, the way the wax softened and pooled, the way the wick glowed even after it had gone out. She thought about how a single flame, no larger than a thumb, could warm a room, guide a child's hand, soften a final breath. And she smiled, because while others made things that roared or clattered, she made something quiet, something still. She made light, and now the flames are dimming. The last trades have passed like the flicker of candles in a long hallway. The bone collector has vanished into the mist, his cart grown still. The candle maker's wax has cooled. The bell ringer's tower is dark. The lanterns have all been lit, and then, one by one, gone out again. You've walked alongside a quiet crowd tonight, a procession of the nearly forgotten, not kings or conquerors or saints, but people who lived in the corners of history, who rose before dawn, who worked after sunset, who carried fire or stone or silence and left no names behind. They did not write the stories, but they lit the rooms in which stories were written. They didn't sit on thrones, but they carved the chairs, stitched the cushions, and swept the floors before the crowns ever entered the room. They were there in the shadows, always, doing what needed to be done so the rest of the world could go on spinning. Perhaps that's why they're still here, echoing gently through the rhythm of your breathing. The sound of a wick catching, the muffled clink of bones in a burlap sack, the soft footstep of someone walking alone through frost-bitten grass toward a field that needed smoothing, toward a door that would not open itself. Their days were long, but quiet, their voices few, but steady. And in this quiet moment, you carry them with you, without weight, without urgency, just memory, just a hush. Somewhere beyond the edge of the village, a kiln still glows faintly. Somewhere deeper still, the marsh water ripples as a leech floats to the surface. Somewhere, a single candle is still burning, forgotten on a windowsill, flame bent toward the wall in a breeze that no one feels. You may not remember every name, every task, every step taken through mud and dust and soot. That's all right. Let it all fade now, slowly, gently. Let the markets grow still. Let the smoke from the chimneys wind its way into the stars. Let the soft toll of a bell mark the hour, not as a summons, but a lullaby. You are safe. You are still. There is nothing more to carry. No more words to hold. Only the echo of quiet hands doing quiet work in a quiet world that has long since gone to sleep. Let it carry you now, downward, softer, slower. The light is gone. The fire is low, and so are you. Good night.